Greetings and welcome to another Lessons with Odin. Today we are going to be talking about dangly parts. Now, this is going to be part of my basics series where I show you tips and beginning stitches and intermediate stitches and a whole bunch of little fundamentals that you should probably know if you want to fluff out your bead making arsenal. Now, I decided to talk about this because there are a lot of patterns out there that have very specific beads when it comes to their dangly drops and whatever they want to use. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the bead hole orientations and how you really don't need to order the specific bead shapes in order to make it work for your pattern. You can probably just do whatever you want with whatever you have. Now, I want to talk about the different kinds of drops that you can procure. First off is the typical teardrop bead. This one is more round-shaped, and it kind of doesn't really matter where the hole orientation is on this, because it's going to pretty much fall wherever it wants and stay dangly, no matter where you put it. These are also referred to as top-drilled, I believe, because the top is drilled. So these are your teardrops, your briolets, your top-drilled bicones, what have you. Something that's generally skinny at the top and droppy at the bottom. These also can include your spike beads. Spike beads are top-drilled, however, they are different because they are wider at the top and pointy at the bottom, like I like a lot of my bead shapes. So attaching these kinds of beads are essentially the same, however, the only difference is you may need to adjust the amount of beads on your initial base in order to make sure this doesn't show too much thread and it kind of falls where gravity lets it. So for example, whenever you are making your dangly parts, you will generally need some seed beads of some form. Play with textures when it comes to creating your teardrops. Sometimes you might want size 15 seed beads, sometimes you want size 11. I'm using size 11 right now. And generally you'll want some sort of accent bead. This is what I refer to any sort of bead shape that you use to anchor the fringe. A lot of the times it doesn't really matter what shape this bead is or even what size it is, just as long as it coordinates and it serves its purpose. If it's got a hole in it, it's generally pretty good. Sometimes I like to have fun with my accent beads and do little brass or metal pieces that kind of express myself. I've got the skull there, as well as my favorite scarabs here. That could be an accent piece. In this example I showed you, I've used crystal clover beads, just something that makes an interesting flair to your pendant. If your pattern doesn't tell you how many beads to add, this is generally how things will go. You'll first thread on the beads for your fringe drop. This first 3 is going to cover half of the width that you have between the gaps of your fringe. So for example, in this piece, my thread is coming out of this seed bead here. My destination is in this seed bead here. I'm guesstimating that I'm going to need about 6 beads in order to make a reasonable loop between these two areas. So half of that, I'm going to make 3 beads. Then I'm going to add my accent beads on my thread. Then this is responsible for containing my drop. In this case, I've got 3 seed beads, my drop bead, and another 3 seed beads. Now, this will be dependent on how wide your tip is. If you like to have it falling really loose, you might want to add more. But with something as narrow as this, 2 or 3 seed beads are probably good enough. And we'll go over the spike bead in a second to see the differences. So this is what you should have when you have pulled everything down to the end of your piece. Your next step is to completely ignore the bead connected to the teardrop bead, because this is just going to form a loop underneath the accent bead. So then all we're going to do is pick up our accent bead. And we pull that tight. And we see our beads have wrapped around the sides of our teardrop. From there, I'm going to add 3 more beads because that's going to take the gap on the opposite side. We need to fill this space in order to complete our drop. So I've added 3 beads. I pull that tight, and now we see we have our drop completed. So I'll show you a few different tricks when it comes to the spike bead. So here's what I've strung on in order to prepare for my spike bead. I've got half of the distance of our gap up here that we need to take care of, so I've got my 3 seed beads here. And a little extra thing that I did this time is that I've sandwiched 2 contrasting colors of seed beads around the accent bead. Now, this isn't necessarily a requirement, it just adds a nice bit of contrast with your beads, and if you have larger beads or beads that are just weirdly shaped that they don't have nice corners to sit in, for the threads to sit in. So as you can see on this clover bead, I have 2 seed beads sandwiched in there to kind of narrow where the threads are going to go. Because of the way this is pointy, you see how the crystal itself is cut very narrow. These 2 threads of seed beads are going to fight with positioning in there, and it's going to look a little sloppy. So I like to add in my weird irregular shapes, I like to make sure that I have seed beads on each side, just so that the thread path has a very nice channel to go into. So that's what I have done here. And finally, in order to compensate for the size of the spike bead, I've added 5 seed beads on each side instead of 3. Then to anchor that to our piece, it's going to be pretty much the same exact thing. I'm going to skip over the beads that are connected to the spike. These are going to wrap around to form a nice little basket or a dip sort of thing for it to sit. Then I'm going to pick up my accent bead as well as the 2 seed beads on each side. This makes sure the thread channels in, because the thread is going to be so wide with the spike, as well as over here, it kind of gives a nice sort of bottlenecking motion to make sure everything sits properly. So when we pull that tight, you'll see that the beads have wrapped around the spike nicely. You may need to play with it depending on the size of your spike. You might need to add more, you might need to add less, because generally fringe doesn't sit where you want it to be, no matter how many times you reinforce it. All that is left is to add my remaining 3 beads to make up for the size here, and pass through to finish my fringe. Now there's one more type of pendant shape that I kind of want to talk about, even though the stringing is very similar. We have these ones that have more of a flat motif on them, so that basically the whole is front-facing instead of side-facing. I have another example with this teardrop, which is really squished and flat, but the whole is going to make the thread wrap around in the front of it instead of this way. Now when it comes to adding it to your fringe, the process is exactly the same. There's just a few things that you might need to keep aware of. I'm going to do the same exact thing I've been doing for the other teardrops. I've got my half width that I need to cover up here, my accent bead, and then the beads that are going to wrap around my teardrop. Then I'm going to do the same exact things to anchor it in place by passing it through the accent bead, adding on my remaining beads, and then jumping the gap. And that is what your drop will look like. You'll see how the beads curl around the front of the piece compared to the teardrop, where it kind of just hangs forward and it doesn't really block the shape of the design of the crystal. This one gives challenges just because sometimes when you, especially if you have really reinforced thread tension, crystal will twist around and not want to sit nice and flat. Whenever you have the piece on display or when you're wearing it, things are going to twist around as you move. So that's just one little annoyance that you might want to be aware of. But because of this anchor bead over here, it's got a pivot point, so you can easily fix it when it moves and misbehaves. It also depends exactly on what the pattern is. If it's just a simple fringe drop, then these rules can definitely apply and become interchangeable, these bead shapes. But depending on how things are sticking out, you may have to change shape, or depending on what the pattern tells you to do. But it kind of gives you an idea to play around with what you want to do. Finally, we have these kinds of teardrops, which I'm not sure how to refer to them, but they're like the full drilled, or they're the ones there the hole is completely vertical and is not side drilled. So these will be a little bit different in order to alternate between this pattern. So this is how I've threaded my beads in preparation for this kind of fringe. I've got my 3 beads that are going to act as my bridge across the gap. That's the same. I've added my accent bead with 2 separate beads sandwiching it. The accent bead in this example is kind of optional, because it doesn't really serve its purpose here. With these beads, these kind of had a nice channel to split the drops around from one thread to another, so it kind of makes a nice little anchor point here. But here, this one just adds a nice reduction in bead size, and just adds some length to the fringe if that's what you're going for. Then I've added 1 seed bead on top, because if I didn't have my accent bead there, I would need something to reduce my threads between the width that I have in this gap here. So I've got 1 bead for that, I've got my teardrop, and I've got my 1 bead here to serve as my fringe piece, and to hold the teardrop down. So I'm going to pull all these back, and I'm going to skip over this anchor bead here, because what would happen if I didn't and just passed right through, my beads would fall off. So that 1 seed bead there is essentially a stop bead. Another thing to note is when you're threading this on, you can also play with orientation. You can have the regular teardrop profile by threading from the narrow end to the wide end, so that it sits like that, or you can also thread it from the wide end down to the narrow end, just to have a little different shape profile on whatever you're threading. So once again, I'm going to skip over this bead, then I'm going to pass through the teardrop, any beads that are in the path between this one and the beads that I use to bridge the gap. So here it would be that 1 seed bead on top, the accent bead set, then I pull tight, add on the rest of my gap beads, and finish my drop. So, as you can see, there are very subtle differences between these 2 types of holes. So if you only have like top drills, while the pattern calls for bottom drills, you totally can just interchange them. Just keep these tips in mind when you do so. But yes, I think that will do it for me. I hope this inspired you to play with your drop possibilities. It was kind of a basic primer, but it's good fundamentals for those who are more experienced, and for very beginners who are afraid of drops, don't be! I hope you like this beginner series. I have a lot more videos planned out, and there should be a playlist attached to this as well, so you can see more stitches, techniques, tips, and hacks to help you on your beading journey. If you have any other tips, come and join us on our beading community at Creations from Lessons with Odin. We have a lovely little community where we share tips, we share our projects, and we just talk beady things. And cats. There's quite a bit of cat talk there, too. So, come and join us. Link is down below. And if you have other suggestions for any sorts of beading stitches, tips, techniques that you want me to demonstrate for you, also be sure to leave that in the comments. And be sure to like up and subscribe if you want to see more bullshit from me. Check out my other jewelry tutorials. Check out my other shenanigans on my channel, because I do more than just jewelry. If you're into sci-fi, I just released a book, so be sure to check out my fiction stuff. I have a blog down below, as well as I just released a book on Amazon. All pertinent links are down below. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and of course, if there's anything I need to be trying out right now, feel free to let me know down below. And I will see you next time.